If you haven't heard, there's a great new podcast that you really ought to be listening to. It's called Stranger Becomes Neighbor. From KSL Podcasts, I'm Dave Cawley, and I have the great honor of sitting down with journalist Andrea Smardon, who is the host of Stranger Becomes Neighbor. We're talking about episode 3 of the podcast. So if you haven't yet listened to episodes 1 and 2, go hit those and then come back and join us because we're going to talk here about episode 3. Andrea, thank you for being with me again.
Thank you.
Episode 3 is probably my favorite of the series. I'm just going to throw that out there because I feel like as a listener, I was transported to Afghanistan during the 2 decades long war. And I met somebody who I would never have otherwise met. Tell me about Seema.
Yeah, Seema, a young woman in her 20s, trained with U.S. Special Forces to be in this elite unit of soldiers. There were, I think, 43 of them who were trained, Afghan women trained to work with U.S. Special Forces to go out on these dangerous night raids where they needed women to be able to communicate with the women and children in the households. So they had to go through rigorous training in order to do this. They also had to do this at great risk to their own safety. Not only were these missions incredibly dangerous, they're dropping out of helicopters and banging on people's doors and entering into enemy territory. So that was dangerous in itself. Then it was dangerous just to be a woman in Afghanistan working in the military itself. And then on top of that, working with the U.S., on top of that, working with men. So it broke all kinds of cultural stereotypes and taboos. And so it was dangerous for them, even for neighbors to know about what they did for work. So they would hide what they did for work. And so these stories are only coming out now that the U.S. has pulled out. And so now we get to learn about this amazing female tactical platoon that I didn't know about until I went into Seema's hotel room.
I mean, I think many of us, myself included, completely ignorant of this for all the reasons that you lay out. As a journalist, did that make it hard when you're hearing this story about this unit, about Seema's experience, and you bear the task of trying to verify what she's telling you, but I mean, in a lot of ways, there is going to be no good source to verify the story. How difficult was that to go back and take what you were hearing and say, is this real? Did this really happen?
Mm-hmm. Well, and the other thing you didn't mention is that I talked to her through a translator, which is another challenge.
Right,
So I don't know exactly what was said, and it's harder to follow up and get clarification. So she's telling me these amazing stories, and I'm just hoping I'm getting it all right. But part of this storytelling is not just to talk to Seema. Piecing this story together, I also talked with the American women who worked closely with her and who end up being an important part of the story because they help bring her to the U.S. and help get her resettled here. So I do get the stories in some sense from different sources.
Mm-hmm.
Different aspects of the story I'm getting. The Americans' experience is different than the Afghan experience, but they have a relationship. And so I basically was piecing it together as I went along, and it was really interesting to me. And I hope that listeners get that sense when they listen to the podcast as you keep meeting new people and the picture keeps getting fuller and fuller, right?
Yeah. Those American service members, those women that we hear in episode 3, they have a name for themselves.
Right. There's a lot of acronyms here, but the cultural support team. So they call themselves the CSTs. And then the Afghan units are called the FTPs, the Female Tactical Platoon.
Okay.
So, yeah, I had to learn some lingo for
this
this
podcast. A lot
podcast.
of military jargon. And then once they are stateside and they're doing this job of trying to help these women they worked with in Afghanistan get out of Afghanistan and then settle in the United States, there's also another title, Sisters of Service.
Right. So the CSTs, the American women, as they were watching the fall of Kabul in Afghanistan and watching this chaotic evacuation, they are scrambling to do anything they can to get the 43 women that they know are in great danger if they stay in Afghanistan. And something that was remarkable to me that I learned in talking to these women is that there wasn't really a plan from the U.S. military or the U.S. government to get these women out. There was no plan for them to protect them, even though they were obviously a great danger. And there was, even within the military and the U.S. government, my understanding is there wasn't a whole lot of knowledge about them because they were intentionally kept secret. So these American women felt this unique responsibility. These service members who had worked with them, they knew exactly how much danger they were in. They knew them personally. They had made a commitment to them that they would serve and protect one another. And they were afraid of what was going to happen to them. So they pulled every string they could just to get them on those airplanes to come to the U.S. And they were successful, but it took constant work for that time during the evacuation. It was, they weren't sleeping. They were trading hours at night when they were on their phones, trying to do everything they could to get people out.
And getting them out is just the first step in a very long process, as we see in this episode, right? Once these remarkable Afghan women are in the United States, in some cases they're scattered. And so this network of American service members, women, may not even be geographically anywhere close to where these Afghan women end up.
Right. So they decide to call themselves Sisters of Service, and they're trying to be this support for these Afghan women. But yeah, like you said, they're not necessarily in the same place with them. So they're reaching out to the local communities where they end up, trying to see if they can find people to help them. But it's a struggle, and they realized pretty quickly that they just went through a sprint, and now they have a marathon to try to help resettle these women. And the other piece of this is that these women don't have permanent status in the U.S. as many of the evacuees in that's true for many of the evacuees in Afghanistan. They didn't have asylum. They didn't have special immigrant visas. So they have to apply for more permanent status. And so they are in this country with uncertainty about their future.
Part of what just blew me away about hearing this piece of Seema's story, as you're talking to her through an interpreter, is here's this young woman who is highly skilled, remarkably courageous, in the United States, has done physically demanding, dangerous military work alongside U.S. service members in Afghanistan. And now that she's in the United States, she's trying to find a job, and she ends up as a cashier. And she tells you about the stress of that job. And for me as a listener, hearing Seema talk that way really provided a perspective that I had not expected to hear in this podcast. Were you surprised by what she told you?
I wouldn't say I was surprised. I was just struck by the struggle just to get by. And I think, and what's interesting to me is that I think it's reflective of a lot of Americans have a similar experience. If you're low income, trying to work, if you're working at Walmart on a part-time job and you have a kid in daycare and then you have to pay rent, it's really hard to do. It's like the math doesn't add up. In Seema's case, she had rent of $2,000. And, for a while, the resettlement agencies, there's funding for that, and then it runs out at some point. And so that's part of the source of the stress for her is this, how am I going to be able to afford everything I need to afford? And so I think it's stressful for anyone on top of being, you've left your homeland. And in Seema's case, her husband was killed in Afghanistan and she has a young child. She's a single mother. So she needs support. And I think it to me, it reveals something about America, because I think there are a lot of people in this situation, and you just look at it and you're like, how can you make ends meet? How do you make this work? And you need a support system for it to work.
The Sisters of Service, many members of the military, I know we hear a little bit in the podcast about the burden that these American service members feel. But it impacted me in a way listening that Americans more broadly bear a responsibility to have that attitude of reaching out and helping these Afghan arrivals, refugees, whatever we want to call them. And I'm just curious, do you feel that there is a responsibility, or should somebody who listens be questioning themselves about what do we collectively as Americans owe these Afghans?
I think it's such a good question. It really made me think about, I think it's easy for us in the U.S. to forget about what the military is doing for us, or we give lip service to it, or we say thank you for your service, but we don't really think about the sacrifices that people make to serve in the military. And we don't really know what's going on, right, in Afghanistan or in other places that the military is active. We don't know what's being done in our name, I think. And so I think meeting these Afghans here in the U.S. and then meeting the U.S. military members who care about them and are trying to take care of them, really, it made me think a lot more about those who do take on military service and how much of the weight they are carrying for our entire country. And, it used to be that more people served in the military, so it was more of a common experience. Now it's such a small percentage of the population that it's so easy for us to not know or care, I guess, what they've undertaken. And what struck me, and the people that I've met in doing this podcast, it struck me the weight that they are carrying for all of us. So it did really make me think about that. What is our responsibility as neighbors, as regular citizens, if we know that there's an Afghan family in our neighborhood? What is our responsibility? What
do we do individually? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Stranger Becomes Neighbor is a remarkable podcast. You've done amazing work, Andrea.
Thank you.
For people who have listened to episode 1 and 2, hopefully they followed. But for people who are new to the show, where should they go to follow Stranger Becomes Neighbor?
You can find it anywhere you listen to podcasts, and the website is strangerbecomesneighbor.com.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.